Okay, we're gonna get going. Thank you all for being here in the room here in Ottawa, as well as the people joining us online over Zoom from across the country, I believe. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I think as we have these conversations about resistance and alternatives, it's important to remember that we're on unceded Indigenous territory and keep that present in all we talk about. So the theme of this session is thinking about how resisting the injustice and the unsustainability, the systems that we don't want, and how building the alternatives and the solutions of the world we want, how these two sort of strategies or these two approaches to change work together. And we have some exciting guests. Kanahus has just joined. Kanahus, can you share your screen when you get a chance? And turn on your mic, I guess. So we have three exciting panelists. We have Kanahus Manuel, who's Secwepemc from British Columbia, and she is part of the Secwepemc Women Warrior Society, and she's also the leader of the Tiny House Warriors, who have been building tiny houses along the pathway of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which got announced by Trudeau last week or the week before to be approved. And so she is right now in intense protest with the tiny houses. They were in Victoria yesterday, I believe. She'll tell us more about that. But the Tiny House Warriors, in my mind, are one of the greatest examples of the alternatives being in the pathway of the problems and the injustice. And so we're excited to have Kanahus here. Also, we have Jadin Lavalie, who is a Two-Spirit Michif Cree woman. Currently, she lives in Dish with One Spoon territory, which is also known as Hamilton, Ontario. And she spends most of her efforts on anti-extractive and land defense struggles, but she's also dedicated herself to defending her city against gentrification, fighting patriarchy inside and outside of organizing circles, and pushing for animal liberation. And lastly, we have Leia Temper, who is a political ecologist and ecological economist. She's the founder of the Global Atlas for Environmental Justice, which she'll tell us about, as well as she's the leader of the Acknowledge Project, which is academic activist co-production of knowledge for environmental justice, which is an exciting research partnership that we've both been involved with. And she'll tell us more about that as well. And I'm Jen Gobby. I organize with Climate Justice Montreal, and I'm also a PhD candidate at McGill in the Economics for the Anthropocene Project. And I'm really excited to be here and to be doing this slightly, I think, exciting, innovative session where we have activists and citizens on the ground, as well as some academics and practitioners here in the room at a conference, and see what kind of exciting insight can happen from this bringing together many minds. So as we go, feel free to think about questions or comments. People online, you can type them into the chat and share your ideas that way and your questions. And for the people in the room, I've put some paper here. Feel free to write down your question and then just bring it up and put it here, and I can bring those questions to the conversation as we go. So before we get going with the panelists introducing themselves, I'd like to again see how Kanahus is doing in being able to share her, turn on her video. How's that going, Kanahus? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Great. Oh, there you are. Thank you for joining us. Let us know if at any point you're having technical difficulties and think you're going to have to cut out, and we'll just go right to you. You let us know, okay?
Yeah, I am going to have technical difficulties. I know it.
Okay, well, we'll move to you quickly. So maybe I do want to acknowledge that this session has been funded by the Transformations to Sustainability program of the International Science Council, and they've been supporting this session. So I'm going to talk about them more towards the end, so we have room now to get going. So I'm going to invite Kanahus to introduce herself and her work, and maybe then I'll ask the other two to introduce themselves and their work, and then we'll go more into talking about this intersection of resistance and solutions. So Kanahus, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kanahus Manuel, and it means red woman in Tanaka. I'm from the Secwepemc and the Tanaka Nations. My father, his mother was from the Kootenays, from St. Mary's Indian Reserve near Cranbrook. That's where she grew up, went to Indian residential school there in Cranbrook. And my father, he also went to Indian residential school. My grandfather, Dr. George, Dr. Grand Chief George Manuel, also went to residential school, but we have amazing land defenders and freedom fighters in our family. And I was privileged to grow up around tables where the political discussion was heated and where we continued to talk about Aboriginal title and rights, Indigenous title and rights. And it continued to be a conversation that we had in our family on an everyday basis. And I'm here speaking because Jen has invited me, and I met her before as I traveled east, still spreading the message about our fighting for our land, title, and rights. But what has brought me here today is the Tiny House Warriors and amazing mission and job that we have building 10 tiny houses to be placed on the path of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And myself, not being a builder, it's been a big experience. And we are building homes. Our mission is to build 10 of them, and they're on wheels and they're solarized, and we're going to be putting them on the path of the pipeline. Right now, there's 4 homes up in Blue River that are blockading the construction of a 1,000-man man camp, and the man camps are the housing or the places where they want to house 1,000 men to lay the pipes for this pipeline. So this is the beginning stages of their construction, is to build the man camp. So we have people up there looking after the homes right now. My mother and elders are up there on the front lines, and there's children on the front lines, families stopping this pipeline in the path of it. And the houses that we've built so far, like, are going out onto the territory, but some of them are bigger than the other ones. And we've had 3 a total built by volunteers from Victoria area, which is so amazing. And this last tiny house that we just went to go pick up in Victoria, I'm in Vancouver right now, we picked it up and it took them 10 days to build, and it's the shell of the house. There's no interior in it, but it took them 10 days. So it's important to support, and you're going to see this one that we have here in Vancouver as we leave. You can check out a live feed. We're going to be leaving Vancouver shortly after this, and we'll be bringing it and putting it in a different location, a strategic location that will be there acting and being a home for our people as we're put it in the path of the pipeline. So people are actually putting their homes and bodies on the line to stop this construction. Sorry if I took so long. I don't know if you want me to do more than that for my introduction, but I know I'll keep on going and cut everybody else off. So I'm just going to end there.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, we will move on to the other 2 panelists to introduce themselves, but if at any point you feel like you're going to have to go, so you let me know, just cut in, and I'm going to ask you some pointed questions before you have to go.
Okay.
So you just let me know. So let's move on to Jaydene. Would you like to introduce yourself and your work?
Hi, so I'm Jadin. As Jen said, my family is Michif Cree, from around Red River settlement, but then also after resistance pushed further, mostly into Saskatchewan, where majority of them ended up settling around Meadow Lake area. But I currently live in Ontario, and so I'm connected to Anishinaabe communities out here more than I am communities of Cree people, but it's great. And over the years, I've been involved in resistance struggles that have happened locally out here. So around stopping Line 9, and then later a campaign around Line 10 that involves a variety of both like daytime and nighttime direct actions against the pipeline, as well as supporting Chippewa, the Thames First Nation, where I have my Sundance family in their Supreme Court challenge against the Canadian, which of course they lost. We lost in the end. And in recent years, I've been actually just thinking a lot more about like what land defense even looks like in Southern Ontario, given that like there are no active pipeline challenges happening here. But definitely in the last year, it's been switching my focus to just more immediate problems that are all around me, a little bit out of necessity, I would say, out of survival. So like we've been engaged in a pretty like extended anti-gentrification struggle in Hamilton against like the influx of Toronto capital and money and people moving there. And just this also kind of the rise of like a far right presence in the city that I feel like we've paid more attention to or less attention to over the years. But most recently this Saturday or last Saturday, being involved in a confrontation of some homophobic right-wing nationalists who decided to crash the Pride festivities in Hamilton. And we are now embroiled in a somewhat like big scandal and confrontation with the police. They've like arrested one of my like dear friends who's a trans activist who spoke out against them. They are currently in jail on false accusations of actually being at the protest, which they weren't because they are currently on parole for a lot of the anti-gentrification struggle that we were involved in last year. So they're actually like falsely imprisoned right now. So for the last week, I've been like pretty intensely wrapped up in trying to mobilize public pressure around having their charges dropped. Also, my partner and one other local queer activist are both also facing breach charges, whilst none of the very homophobic and violent right-wing street preachers have faced any charges at all. So right now that's basically eating up most of my time. Hopefully we're going to get my friend out of jail. So sorry for that shameless plug, but if you see any free CEDAR like information going around on the internet, I would urge you to support that and donate money and also like spread the word and create, help contribute to this public pressure campaign we have to get them out of prison. Other than that, I can say that, I met Jen several years ago. I think probably doing like Omjanong solidarity stuff out of Chemical Valley with like Vanessa Gray and Beezy, and just got back in touch like about a month ago. I did a different talk for her, so I'm like really happy to be here, really stoked to be on a panel. You Kanahus have been like watching a lot of what you guys are doing and feeling like very inspired, and hopefully maybe we can even connect after this and talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, so thanks for letting me be here.
Thanks for being here, Jadin, and thanks for introducing yourself. Now over to Leia Temper to introduce herself.
Hello, and yeah, thank you. It's so amazing to be sharing this panel with the three of you. So thank you, Jen, for organizing this and inviting me. My name is Leia Temper, and I say I'm like a scholar activist. I've been working for many years documenting and working together with and for environmental justice movements. I was based a long time in Barcelona, Spain, and the work we were doing is really global in scope. So working with movements and organizations that are, kind of bringing together frontline communities around the world. So from that work emerged a project called the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice. And I can just share with you quickly. Oops, let's see. I was going to share just a screenshot so you can get an idea of what that project looks like. So I'm not that good at this. So this is a global atlas where we document ecological conflicts around the world and different resistance movements. These are, like the frontline communities fighting the Trans Mountain Pipeline, communities that are on the front line resisting being polluted, resisting being displaced, and also putting forward other visions. And you know, I think I'm happy that we have this space at this conference, and also thank you, Jenny, for your talk, because there's a lot of discussion about what are, you know, asking yesterday, what are the countervailing forces against these incumbent interests? And there's all this talk about social transformation, but there's very little talk about activists on the ground that are actually doing the work of social transformation. And if we can't acknowledge that work and figure out how we can work in support as activists, as scholar activists and engaged scholars, then can we really say that we are interested in social transformation? So thanks again, Jen, for making this a space here. And as Jen mentioned, I'm also the PI of a project called Acknowledge, activist academic co-production of knowledge for environmental justice. And in this project, we really focus on how movements against extractivism create alternatives through the process of resistance, and also the, you know, how resistance and different alternatives emerge from engaging in resistance. And the other thing that we look at a lot is how we co-produce knowledge and how we bring reflexivity to the process, and how we can practice allyship as academics, which is, you know, not necessarily a straightforward or easy processes without actually making academia extractivist itself. So how do we practice non-extractivist academia? Okay, I think I'll leave it there.
Can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Yeah.
So, yeah, the question of how resistance work and building the alternatives, how those things work together is an interesting theoretical question, but way more importantly than a theoretical question, these things are happening on the ground. Sometimes in isolation from each other. There's a lot of work going on with people building solutions and alternatives in Canada, across the world. And there's a lot of, as Leah showed in that map of the atlas, there are a lot of points of resistance where people are resisting extractivism and other injustices. And sometimes these things are happening jointly. And Kanahus's Tiny House Warriors is one of the greatest examples, I think, currently in the world of where these resistance and solutions are coming together to be a very, very powerful strategy for transformation. So I'd like to ask you, Kanahus, to get going. What inspired you to do this strategy of putting the solutions in the pathway of the problem? Why did you think that was going to be powerful, and how has it been going?
Am I unmuted?
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, everybody. What I see on my screen right now is all the people in the room with the desks and everything. So hi, everybody. I see you all there.
You can choose
yeah,
what you see.
yeah.
You can choose
Oh,
what you
do
see.
I?
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at all of you. You look really important and real eager to learn things. But Tiny House Warriors is like really, really. It really came together through a group of women that I organized with the Secwepemc Women Warrior Society. They're my.
You've been muted.
We just lost you, sound-wise.
But we come from three communities. Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, we lost you for a bit after you said you were organizing with the
Secwepemc Women's Society. So we just got you back though. So maybe start.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So we started working with we wanted to fight this pipeline, and fighting the pipeline was one of the big issues. We're fighting mining, we're fighting all season resorts, ski resorts in our area. So a lot of things that are just around locally that are surrounding our Indian Reserve, our communities we're continuing to resist against. But as a bigger fight, this pipeline was, you know, threatening over 500 kilometers of our territory. Over the half of this pipeline goes to our land. And we knew we needed to be active on the line, which is a big geographical area. When we're fighting Sun Peak Ski Resort, it's like 2 mountains. We had to, like 3 or 4 mountains we had to base ourselves around. But now it's like 518 kilometers of pipeline. And we knew that we needed to resist on the ground, because we knew that there was going to be other people that were going to handle like political strategies, legal strategies, you know, on how we're going to fight this pipeline. But for us, being the warriors we know that we need a front line. We know we need to be on the ground confronting this pipeline in order for any legal or political strategy to have any power. And so being on the ground was very important. And with our previous resistance that we've had against the Canadian state and these corporations that coming into our land, we end up falling within injunctions. And we know that Kinder Morgan applied and got an injunction. And then they applied to increase the injunction, to increase this injunction to for the whole 1,000 kilometers of line. I'm not sure if it applies to Alberta because the line goes into Alberta. So I'm not sure if the injunction applies for Alberta, but it's a big area that we had to say we don't want to end up in injunction, criminal court injunction proceedings for years and years, because we had to do that too at Sun Peaks. And we decided we're going to build tiny houses on wheels because, I mean, we were even talking in our strategy planning and fighting against this pipeline. And, you know, my family was actually in tears saying, no, we're not going to let Canada and BC to bulldoze another house. We're not going to let them bulldoze our sweat lodges. We're not going to let them arrest 75 people in our community, our elders and women and our youth and our hunters and fishermen, and get them tied up in courts for years and years. Meanwhile, the pipeline is getting built. And so staying out of jail was also very important, because as grassroots organizers, we know which organizers and which people are really solid and there for a lifetime. There's movement people that have committed their life, you know, to defend our lands, to stand up for our rights and fight for our rights. And some people are, you know, they have full-time jobs, and this is just some of their volunteer hours that they could put in for something good. And but these women that I'm talking about, they're in it for a lifetime. I mean, where our lives are being threatened and our title to our lands is being threatened. And every time we let another corporation and the government get away with usurping more land, you know, stealing, taking away access to our lands, you know, every time they take from us, we lose more of our lands and territories, and the access to our territories is getting smaller and smaller as more tenures and, you know, all of these land leases and different things are being gobbled up by the state. Our access to land becomes a lot smaller. So even going up and building these tiny houses on wheels, we had to get volunteers, but it was the solutions, like Jen had said and the other speakers had said, like it's the solutions that we had to really think about, because we're always constantly thinking of the problems. I mean, we had to think about the problems and the issues and the trauma of why our people are the way that they are, the addictions issues, the fentanyl, like our people disappearing, like a lot of the things in our community. There are things that you hear that's going on in Indigenous communities are really happening really at a local reservation level in our communities as well. So a lot of frontline fighters are just actually doing addiction work. A lot of our frontline fighters are full-time doing sexual trauma work. So it's all connected. We don't differentiate between that type of activism work and solutions for our communities and the environmental issues. It's all connected because they've really committed genocide in our people, and our people really have intergenerational trauma of colonization. And so by building solutions, it's showing our people that we love them, that we care for them, that we are looking at solutions, and we're not just looking at our people as being problems, or our land situation as it being a problem. We want to build solutions because there's some things that I hear elders saying all the time, like you hear younger people saying down with the system. Well, you hear a lot of older people saying, oh, we just have to turn our back on the system and go to a different way, back to our way. And we turn our back and that system's going to fall because we don't depend on it anymore. And it was the dependency that like it's the dependency on the state and the government for your home, for your shelter, for your everything. Because when they set up Indian reserves, it was the federal government that had a fiduciary obligation and responsibility to ensure that Indigenous people were looked after, because they were now managing our lands, and they just took control of our lands and started to manage our lands and make money off of our lands, and we never ever got any type of benefits off the wealth of our land, and actually the wealth of our land is deteriorating because of their so-called value that's coming through like this pipeline. And so with us, connecting the dots becomes a big issue. And the Tiny House Warriors, it's a creative art project because we have a bunch of warrior resistors that are saying that they're going to build tiny houses on wheels and they're going to call themselves Tiny House Warriors. And you know, even during this session when we were going through the developing the name for this, everyone, I came back from the bathroom, right, or something, and everyone was like, we came up with the name Kanahus. I was like, well, what is it going to be? And they're like, it's going to be Tiny House Warriors. And I was like, oh my God, we're going to have like all these real warriors looking at us saying, Tiny House Warriors, who the hell are these people? And my sister was like, no, we're warriors and we're building tiny houses and no one's going to say anything to us because they're scared of us. Well, even the warriors are. And so we got volunteer builders and we built these tiny houses. And the first one, it was like really amazing. And we had a friend tell me about living big in a tiny house. It was a YouTube channel and they're really well known all around the world. This man, he travels the world looking at tiny houses, and he had told me about him. So I just reached out to him during our first build and everyone was busy and it was the first day in the build. And he said, hey, I'm in Edmonton and I'm driving to Kamloops and I'll be in Kamloops tomorrow. And I'm like, oh my God, this is just not coincidence. It's like creator doing its work. We're doing the same work, the creator's work. And he came and he did a video and for us and he got it out and it really launched our fight, because the thing about building tiny houses compared to Indigenous people just going on their land and asserting their title by building a solid home on attached to the land, us defending it like crazy warriors we are with our camouflage and masks and everything, we know how the government is going to respond to us. Even though we are building our traditional homes, our pit houses, our other homes we're building on the land, it was so easy for the Canadian government to bulldoze us. But what Tiny House Warriors does is it also gives us protection by putting this out into the world, and people could witness Tiny House Warriors. They witness what's going on, they follow it, and that also gives us protection on the front line, because the Canadian state and the corporation, they know that they can't just attack us because people are watching and people are being witness to these amazing, you know, homes that are going out onto the front line. And we had to be out there all winter long. And before the winter hit, I kept on asking our whole crew of women, like, are we moving this to another spot? Because once the winter hits, we're not moving these homes because of the snow on the mountains. And so we ended up deciding to stay there at this camp, at this proposed man camp site. And they really women are really smart, and I really find that they're really smart strategically in this military way of thinking, because they're like, no, we have this ground, we have 4 tiny houses here, we're not leaving this ground. If we move any of them, we're staying here. Every time a tiny house goes out, we're not leaving it, we're going to claim that area back. And so this area is in Blue River and it's very beautiful. There's lakes, there's rivers, it's mountain caribou area. There's bears, there's deer. I mean, bears go in our kitchen. We have to keep everything pretty clean. But living in these tiny houses, it's really been a very, you know, healing experience being on the land, because it's about being on the land. And we say our land is home. That's the full name of our tiny house warriors. Our land is home. So that's what we really, the message that we're saying is that our land is home. And when we go out onto our land, we can go wherever we want. That's what our title and rights is that we have a right to build a fire where we want and feed our families. We have a right to put our home and rest our children wherever that may be. And by asserting our title is the power that we have, because our ancestors, some of these areas, our ancestors have never had our people singing there for a long time. We haven't had our people there lighting a fire and offering food for the spirits. So these are the things that tiny house warriors and being back onto the territory where that we were forcibly removed off of all those years ago when they set up the Indian reserves. it's getting us off of the Indian reserves. It's getting us out of the 0.2%. And my father calculated that out. He added all the Indian reserves up in Canada and it equaled 0.2%. So not even 1%. And we know who's going to be rich. We know who's going to be poor. And we've always been poor. And because we've been taking off the wealth of our land and put on 0.2. But it's also created a 0.2% mentality for our Indigenous people on those reserves, because just imagine you're living on a reserve where you're forced, we call it a concentration camp, where they have invisible barbed wire fences, but it's only in the mines, because our people have rights and our people could leave those reserves and assert our rights to the greater part of our traditional territory. And so Tiny House Warriors, this is what we're doing. So it's a very powerful political stance. It's more than just a little tiny house. It's a symbol of, 500 years of Indigenous resistance. It's showing that we aren't going to take the Canadian states idea of this is where your home is. No, our home is our land. And so it's like, it continues to grow, because like the tiny houses are about minimizing our imprint on the earth. It's about downsizing. It's about, decluttering our lives, how we live on an everyday basis, what's important for us in our life, because you can't bring everything into a tiny house. You have to pick and choose what you bring in there to live. And it's a really, more than just anything, it's showing us how we need to return back to the land, because we have to minimize our waste. And I know this just by being in this little tiny house village site, just even our human waste. If we have 10 people there compared to if we have 5 people there, or if we have adults there compared to families with children there, we know the amount of waste that we start to create as human beings. And really start looking at our purchases in our society. Do you need this salad dressing that has this bottle and you only have, or are you going to get a big thing of maybe olive oil or coconut oil, and that could be the base for the salad dressing or something? I mean, so much people fill their fridges with condiments. We don't have a fridge. We don't have all these condiments. It was all about creating all these ways for your own senses of, you want to taste this or that. We need to decolonize our taste buds, and food becomes a big part of everything too when you're living in tiny house living and looking after a village of people, because that's still consumption of a lot of food. And so your consumption and your waste become a big conversation around tiny house living. And really your mind starts to become free, because you're not being controlled by the state. You're not dependent on the state, even for your BC Hydro. Like, it's all here in BC. It's all through BC Hydro. So you're not dependent on them. We have everything solarized. Jane Fonda, she's the one that donated for the first solarized time, like the solar panels for the first tiny house. And it was Sacred Earth Solar, previously called Lubicon Solar, that organized and fundraised to donate a solar mobile unit that all 4 of the houses at Blue River are on. And we have 2 that are going up, and we have 1 right here, but I had to go to Wi-Fi because I don't have any data, but I would have showed you the tiny house because I was just standing in front of it, but I had to rush over here. And you could go look at some of the pictures, the beautiful pictures I'm going to continue to put up. Victoria Volunteer Builders, amazing. There was 80 of them that came out during the 10 days of the build. And we went and picked it up, and we shut down the city of Vancouver. We shut down the main artery of the city, the highway, and for around 3 hours, we took over 7 kilometers of the highway during the 22 kilometers march. And all of the people in the blockade that were tied up in traffic for 3 hours were actually in tears thanking us. So we know that there's a lot of support to stop this Trans Mountain pipeline. And we're going to continue to build, and it is really emotional. It's an emotional fight because we're fighting for our lives, and I think people feel it, and we have a lot of support. All those polls that are out there on the mainstream media where it says over half support that pipeline, those are all false. the majority of BC, and I believe that the majority of Canada do not want this pipeline through. We have our relatives over there on the East Coast that are fighting Line 9 and Line 10, and they're saying no, they want to twin that line, don't let them, because they want to put in a 3, 4, 5, and 6, and it's going to be just the same as the East Coast. So we're here to put these homes there, but we're here to bring a message, and we're here to unite with people who believe in alternative building ideas and food security and food sovereignty and, you know, decolonization and what that looks like for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We're about, you know, not having any type of dependency on the state. I'm a birth worker, I'm a tattoo artist. We believe in working with the artists. We're painting all of the murals with stories, or the houses with murals. And so all around the houses are going to be murals of stories, because we're storytellers. That's how we tell our stories, is through, sometimes we'll talk about the salmon on the mural. We'll talk about the coyote and the significance of them in our teachings. And so I'm just going to end there. I know I took up a lot of time, but I just want to thank you for finding interest in this, and I'm really eager to listen to what the other speakers are saying too. So thank you.
Thank you, Kanahus. That was fucking incredible. That was great. You are an intellectual giant. Okay, we'll turn next to Jaydene over in Barrie, Ontario, where she is right now. And Jaydene, I'd love to hear about your take on what you think needs to be taken down, resisted, dismantled, and what you think needs to be built and created, and what you think needs to be rebuilt, and how those different strategies work together.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Kanahus. Yeah, I guess the things that I looked through the questions that you sent, and the things that I've been thinking about most lately have been in terms of, you know, like what we've lost and what we still have, and what we can build in the future. And a lot of my personal beliefs, like I'm a pretty traditional person. I like Sundance, I fast, I follow my traditions, and I like give thanks to the land on a daily basis. But I also organize with a lot of like anarchist communities, and I consider myself an Indigenous anarchist, and I've been trying to figure out exactly what that means, like in the last few years. And there's some really interesting people in the United States and like Flagstaff, Arizona, that are working on that. They're holding a convergence this summer, actually in August, that I'm going to be going to. It's going to be pretty interesting. But yeah, in terms of where I think the struggles are, I think that the struggles that we often talk about are the like frontline struggles against extractive projects. Like, it's important to remember that Canada is essentially just a like colonial machine of extraction. Like it is a resource extraction economy. It was founded this way. Like settlers like first came here in order to like mine resources in order to send some home, but then later to stay, which is why we call it like a settler colonial state instead of just a colonial state. And the longer they stayed, the more they spread out and took control of resources. And so the fight against pipelines and against the tar sands, or against whatever it may be, any sort of land defense project is the same struggle against the colonial state that we've been fighting since the very beginning. It's just one big land grab. And a lot of the struggles that I see these days are actually struggles that I have internally with the narratives of reconciliation, the narratives that I see put forward in our communities and in settler communities. And this is a narrative of reconciliation is really a state narrative that the state of Canada has constructed as if it is time in relations between settlers and Indigenous people to reconcile. I find that to be completely ridiculous. You know, you cannot be continuing to resource grab, to be continuing to land grab, to be continuing to allow the essential genocide of our peoples, while at the same time saying that we're reconciling and that this is a time of truth and reconciliation. I think it's complete nonsense. I think that in reality, what reconciliation looks like a lot is just a new project of assimilation. It looks a lot like recruiting Indigenous youth from remote communities to go to universities. It involves convincing people that we need to work within the system in order to change it. And it's a lot of respectability politics, to be honest. And I am, like, frankly, quite sick of it. I really enjoyed what Kanahus was talking about, how, like, young people are often, like, you know, more likely to say, like, down with the system or whatever. And it is true that there is that tension there. Elders are more like, we need to just turn our backs on the system. And I think both are true. And I take a lot of inspiration from movements like Tiny House Warriors, but I also take inspiration from like the Zapatistas in Chiapas, for instance, and like what autonomy means to them, you know, what it means to live without the state and the importance of that in struggle. And I mostly am looking right now to see, like, what that sort of real autonomy could look like in Canada. And so the questions that you posed were primarily around, like, what does resistance look like, and, like, how does resistance contribute to, like, systems change? I think I read that question a few times today, and I thought, like, what does that even mean? Like, and I looked up what systems change, the definition of that, and I was like, it means nothing. That means nothing to me. It also kind of endows a system with a sort of life of its own, as if, like, there are internal correction mechanisms within the current capitalist system that are there, and resistance is somehow, like, just accelerating those mechanisms. I think that's garbage. I think the system is working exactly the way it was meant to work and has always worked, and it's only getting more efficient. And I think that the alternatives to me are, I find that in a lot of Indigenous worldview. I find it in Indigenous spirituality, in terms of what we actually need to be moving back towards in terms of our relationship with land and our relationship with each other. But I also find it in you know, theories of resistance like anarchism, where we are, like, critiquing state power on a, like, regular basis. We're critiquing capitalism, we're critiquing the ways that those two things move together, but we're also just critiquing hierarchy and systems of power and domination as a whole. I think in some places, systems of traditional governance have retained a, like, degree of, like, holistic solidity or something like that. Like, they look very similar to how they used to, but in a lot of places they don't anymore. And they have adopted a hierarchy that allows it to be more, like, legible to the Canadian state when they are negotiating or in talks. And I find that we, Indigenous communities I'm a part of, understand what consensus decision making is, and they understand organizing ourselves in, like, non-hierarchical ways, and that children have just as much to offer, and they have special gifts as elders. And I'm really interested in rebuilding an autonomy for our communities that looks like deciding how we want to govern ourselves in relation to Indigenous principles and foundations of, like, a non-hierarchical human relation to each other and to the world and to the land. So, you know, it's hard because I feel like those resistance and those alternatives don't always fit completely together. And I'm also, like, of the mindset that I don't necessarily need to know what the solution to capitalism is to know that it is terrible and it needs to go and that it's not doing anything good. And I think that we have a lot of principles on which we can, like, build foundations for something new. and a lot of really good examples. But we also can't sit around and wait for us to come up with a solution before we act to change what is currently happening. And that's all I have to say probably for now.
Thank you, Jadin.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to Leia Temper. And Leah's work with the Acknowledge Project has done some explicit work about this intersection between alternatives and resistance. Theoretical work that's grounded in social movements and social conflicts, environmental conflicts around the world. So I'm going to ask her to speak to what Acknowledge Project has been learning about resistance and alternatives.
Yeah, and thank you to, thanks so much, Jadin and Kanahus. So much of what you're saying rings true and is reflected in different ways in what we've seen emerging. In Acknowledge, so what some of the thoughts I'll share today, they're emerging from the analysis of the close to 3,000 cases of the Atlas, and also within the Acknowledge project, we work with about 8 different case studies of communities that are, resisting extractivism and also putting in place, different alternative projects for their community, and those are located in Turkey, India, Brussels, Bolivia, Venezuela, different ones in Latin America. So yeah, kind of a broad understanding. And I want to start just discussing a little bit like this power of combining resistance and alternatives. This was something we started discussing yesterday. Kind of what is the difference between contentious movements and more consensual movements that are trying to create alternatives. They are practicing other ways of being, alternative practices, alternative ways of life, but they are not necessarily trying to disrupt and dismantle the current system. And I think the most powerful combination is when we're bringing these things together. And I don't think we can underestimate the power of these frontline movements for the types of social change that we're talking about. Just to give you an example, I mean, if you think of all the pipeline struggles over the years that have essentially now, paralyzed the possibility of exporting, huge quantities of very dirty crude from the tar sands, the dirtiest crude in the world. So if Canada has at all, been in line with any of its emissions obligations, it's due to these frontline communities. So I think we really need to keep that into account. But beyond that, I also think we need to really think about how this disruption of the flows of capitalism and the workings of capitalism also causes crisis situations. And it's through these situations of crisis that we are, it leads a lot, all of us more broadly to really have to rethink our values. It throws our values into relief, and it causes a huge process of introspection and rethinking our own sense of self and who we are. And we're seeing this now happening a lot in the Canadian context with the Kinder Morgan pipeline. What are we as a country? Are we an extractivist country? Can we exist without oil? And we might be talking about a process of polarization and conflict. And yes, our perspective is that this conflict is productive and it's needed. We need these conflicts because otherwise we're not able to unearth the injustices that are there. So conflicts, they bring these power relations into relief. They show who is benefiting from the current structures, who is being displaced, polluted, colonized, continually being unsettled, because it's the same people as always who are still being unsettled and also killed and jailed when they do this sort of defense work. So this possibility of actual disruption, actually putting yourself in the path of the pipeline, physically putting yourself in the path of the pipeline, has a really important role in weakening in the terms of this conference, we can say, weakening the regimes that we're talking about, the power regimes that we're talking about. So I think that's one really, really important one. That's this material disruption. And I'm going to be presenting a little bit more some of the results that are coming from the Atlas. And just to say that, sneak preview, these disruptive actions work. So there's different sort of strategies and forms of mobilization that movements can take, but actual disruption of the flows of capitalism are very effective. At the same time, and this is sort of when you're having a blockade, or it could be a land occupation and other things. So you have this sort of dual power. On one hand, you are disrupting, and then on the other hand, you're also creating, and this is what Kanahus was really explaining so wonderfully, you are creating a space and an enclave where you can practice these other worlds and put other ways of being into place. And not just in any way, and I think this is also bringing it back to that difference with consensual politics, is that you have to operate in a very different way from when you don't have an external threat. So there's, a high degree of pressure, for example, to organize decision-making processes that have to happen in a very coordinated way among activists. And what we focus on within Acknowledge, for example, and that we look what we call like a resistance-centered perspective to understanding transformations, is what are the social practices that are emerging from these ways of being together, and how solidarity is built. What are the emotional connections that become to be built in these spaces? And just to give you some examples, and I think some of what emerges from these spaces, actually, we want to also continue to think in the kind of the language of socio-technical transitions, and we think of them as like these niche innovations. So, in the Atlas, we see movements in Latin America. They have been organizing community organized referenda to stop mining. And this started in one community. It worked, it was effective, it was able to stop the mines. It's then been taken up and it's moved across the Latin American continent. So now I think some 80 communities just in Colombia alone have been holding these community-led referenda to stop mining in their projects. So these are social innovations that are emerging from these movements. And I'm not sure how much more time I have. You stop me when.
Give me another 5 minutes or so.
Okay. And while we're on the point of innovation, I think this is another important aspect to bring forward, and also to really think about when we talk about alternatives, what do we talk about? So in some of the presentations this morning, when they talk about innovation, it's always talking about new technologies, like the new and the novel, and you need to be proposing something else and having something new. Actually, when we think of alternatives, alternatives don't have to be new. Alternatives can also be defense of ways of life. So, that can mean turning back, going back, reclaiming. There's so many different forms of, appropriate technologies, low-tech things that communities are reclaiming that they've been turned away from. They are saying, we don't want that development, and their way of life is the alternative. They don't need to be offering something new. That what Jaydene said that was really important, if a company wants to come and put a coal power plant in your community, it's not your responsibility to say, I'm going to solve the energy system. And I mean, that's obviously a result of unfair power relations when they say, well, if you don't want the jobs from the coal power plant, what are you proposing? I mean, it's also not fair to put that burden on communities. They have the right to defend their current ways of life without proposing something new. This concept of, you know, constant novelty, I think we need to move away from that. So yeah, I think this, and this idea of innovation, how we think of innovation. I mean, who are the real innovators? When you're looking at, you know, the work that farmers have been doing, creating seeds over millennia, and they're constantly doing innovation. Peasants are constantly doing innovation in their fields. So it's, you know, we have to really rethink how we think about innovation if we want to be listening to and working with on the ground communities. And then I guess one other thing is that this, kind of going back to this kind of systems analysis, and I think this is like, what is the processes of personal transformation that happen when you are confronted with, you know, you're confronted with systems of oppression and you're forced to fight them. And there's this term, I mean, it's sometimes called cognitive liberation or oppositional consciousness. So how do you move from that situation of saying, oh, I accept the status quo and, you know, kind of go along with it, to saying, no, I have the capacity to act and participate in the creation of new worlds. So, and I think you can track this process even further from understanding, saying, you know, this is not the system we want, and what else is happening out there. So I think that's how we see often, you know, movements begin, saying, you know, oh, you know, there's a power plant, there's a mine that's going to come next to our community. We don't want this. And it begins this whole process of education, that the community begins to gather knowledge about all these issues, conscientization, politicization of these issues, sometimes radicalization, and then that leads to connecting with other movements and really broadening the way we're thinking about things. So it's no longer, you know, just about our individual struggle, but you begins to become broadened to say, realize, okay, this is a much broader issue about the entire energy system, for example. And, you know, some of this, we've been seeing a lot, for example, with communities that are opposing fracking, often, you know, middle-class communities that never had this type of extractive projects come near them. And all of a sudden, you know, after some months and organizing, collective organizing, they're talking about energy democracy. And last point, I think, is this breaking down of alienation. And really how we transform ourselves through the creation of collective agency. So you are no longer feeling like an individual. And, you know, this, when we talk about this Fridays for Future movement, and this is something we can discuss later about whether this climate emergency is a good strategy or not, and how it will be used. But probably the deepest transformation is that each of those students is there feeling part of a collective mass movement, that in our, you know, lives of alienation under capitalism, there's really few opportunities for having that feeling of collective people power.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Leah. We're gonna move into a more interactive part of the session soon, where we're gonna ask, I'm gonna ask the panelists if they have questions or responses to each other. I'm gonna ask people in the room if they have questions to write them on paper and bring them up to me. Please feel free, and the attendees on Zoom, feel free to write questions in the chat box. And I just want to add one thought of my own. One thing is that I think we're hearing alternatives are important. A lot of the people at this conference are focused more on the solutions than the resistance, but we're hearing from this panel that the resistance is absolutely critical, and it's happening, but certain people are taking the brunt of the cost of direct actions are huge. People are going to jail. People around the world are dying from doing this really critical, absolutely necessary work of resistance. And so I think one of the things that all of us can think about is ways to socialize the risk or collectivize the risk of direct action that we know needs to happen. So there's many ways in Canada you can support the work of those people doing direct action. There's a lot of ways you can donate funds to help legal costs. Jaydene mentioned the ways to support what's going on in Hamilton right now in terms of the criminalization of trans activists. So there's lots of ways. And so I think this is another form of solution that we need to think about, is the solution that is giving actual material, concrete support to the people taking on the brunt of direct action. So that's my little piece. So I'd like you all now to spend maybe a minute or two thinking about a question, intervention, comment, especially the panelists for each other. And while you're doing that, I'm going to take a moment to plug yes, is this easy? Yeah, I think the International Science Council, who has a program called the Transformations to Sustainability Program, and they have been supporting this project. So they supporting Acknowledge, but also supporting this session. So they have various principles. They include this focusing on the social dimensions of environmental change, focusing on North-South collaborations, the global North and global South. They're focused on transdisciplinary reflexive research that builds capacity and that's solutions oriented. So they have 3 different projects that they support. One is the Acknowledge, the other one is called the Pathways Network, and the other is T-Learning. So we just like to acknowledge them, the important work they're doing, and our gratitude for them supporting, helping us bring in Jaydene and Kanahus and facilitating this. So thank you to them. It's called Transformations to Sustainability, and it's part of the International Science Council. So, okay, I'm going to first ask if Kanahus, do you have any questions or comments or responses to Jaydene or Leah?
Yeah,
No,
it was just so amazing. And some of the things that I thought of is everybody's the economic portion of fighting and resistance and educating and people understanding about Indigenous economies, and how when you start to switch and look at the Indigenous economies, you're going to see another way of, thinking, and the value that we put in our lands and everything that continues to make our lands the way it is, beauty and water and glaciers and no destruction. And that's the value, and that's the wealth of our lands, is this whole life, how everything is interconnected, and the water from the top of the glaciers, how it touches every living thing, in the rivers. Like that's our economy. And we never looked at our economy as like we becoming rich with a monetary value or material possessions are rich, and we're trillionaires even farther than that, because you can't even quantify the value and wealth in the capitalist monetary way. And so those are the types of things, like I was thinking about as hearing both the speakers too, and that when we do start to change our ways and we start to look at decolonization, and as Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who everybody should know and look at some of the books that he's written, but as we start to change and decolonize as Indigenous people, the activity of our brain continues to like just, with our visions, with our meditations of what we see for the future, and changing our actual ways of living a colonized way and into our own Indigenous ways, like one of the speakers said about alternative doesn't mean an alternative way. Like for us, it means going back to our way. And even living in a traditional pit house, round, one room, all family, one room, that breaks away so much things. You can't hide anything. You can't be sneaky. Like some of the things that we don't condone in our way. There's certain things, living in a circle and living underground, it does something when you're living in the earth. Like those types of things, you're decolonizing, you're going back to your traditional ways. It's people will call it an alternative way of living, but your mind starts to expand, and that's what we need. We need people to look at indigenous, our indigenous ways are going to teach so much of the world. That's why when the last speaker said about the climate change, is the best strategy? Like, what do we really want? What are the solution? What do we really want? What is it that every human being needs to live? What is it that everything, even the emotional fulfillment that human beings need? You know, we've been neglected as each other. Are we checking in with each other every single day? We need to be looking after and nourishing our own people that are giving so much to the planet, and especially as, you know, so-called activists or freedom fighters, land defenders, we look out for so much. Those people there that are on the front lines are doing, you know, such a big amount of work, because it's affecting so much different people, not just one, like hundreds. Like there's like, and through social media is just so powerful. Like thousands of people will come up to me to say that they saw the work that we're doing, you know, and we're not able to get on mainstream media to get our stuff out there all the time. Even to just get a press release out is, you know, a lot of work for a lot of grassroots people.
Mm-hmm.
So I love what you did here, Jen, and calling these women together, and it's really powerful. And sometimes, you know, it's going to take people to start connecting these dots for our people, and our mind is going to expand, and it's a collective knowledge that we have all together. This collective knowledge is really powerful, and even just this is just blowing my mind away, and I'm so glad that you pulled everybody together for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanahus. Jaydene, do you have any questions for the other panelists or responses or anything you'd like to add?
I guess I have a response, but it's maybe not so much. I guess I was having some feelings and Leah was talking, Leah, not necessarily about the content of your work, but in the context that like you even need to be doing work like you're doing or something. Like I think I often have these feelings at these like more academic settings where like the context of some people's work is like trying to just prove that like direct action works. And I'm just like, why does anybody do research on this? Like it's obvious. Like it's like the most obvious thing ever. It's like, of course you can't change anything without resistance on the ground. Like that's not a question. Like, you know, like it's been that's the only way anything's ever changed throughout all of history. Like, and I look at like a lot of these like new fields emerging that like are studying social movements and studying the like, you know, like effects on it. It's like, well, like when you participate in these struggles, like you have a greater sense of togetherness and empowerment and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, that's great, but like you can't learn that from a book. And like realistically, like I think the like professionalization around trying to like study social movements is like part of the problem, because it like allows people to feel like they're part of them when they're actually not. Like I don't actually believe that like we can change the system from within. I think that's garbage. I think like we have like been proven time and time again that like the state is an expert at like recuperation of like social movements, and when like social struggles come to the forefront, it's like people on the ground leading resistance. They have like a lot of like huge ideas about what shouldn't be here anymore and what should be here. And what happens is like academia and like state actors will like, you know, recuperate that struggle. And what I mean by that is like they see that it's a threat, and so they act in ways to make it look as though they're on side with that threat, while at the same time minimalizing it by adopting it, repackaging it, and putting it out in the world as a reformist measure that's like far more palatable to the current system, you know? So it's like queer people rioting in Stonewall is now like over the years packaged until Pride is a parade. and we're all talking about like how great it is about diversity, but yet like queer people are not respected in this society. Like queer people are not like equal members of society unless you have money. It's like what actually matters in society is money. Just like there are Indigenous people who matter in the society as long as they have money. And a lot of the like politics around identity have been like very, very expertly co-opted into that. So now you see people saying that like autonomy for Indigenous people is like owning our own banks, or going to university and becoming professionals so that we can like go back to our communities and like be social workers for ourselves. And I think that's all garbage. I think it's like a distraction. And I think that like, yeah, I think that like the only way that you can understand like what it actually means to resist and feel the freedom in resistance is to actually do it. And I think that like reading about it in books and like basing an academic career around it is like counterproductive, because it actually just like creates a system in which like you have too much to lose to actually participate in those struggles. People are like way too invested in the system. You've spent 12 years like getting your doctorate. Now you're like invested in like the institution as a thing because you had to prove to yourself that like academia is somehow radical in order to justify doing all the work. And now like you have too much to lose to actually like get out there and change the system, because your life has become like very comfortable within the system. And like most things that we do to make ourselves more comfortable within this current system actually preclude us from changing it. And pursuing like reformist measures and like asking the state to implement solutions is only ever going to like create a new state that may be based around more like climate friendly policies and like climate friendly energy policies and energy procedures and where we get our energy and how things are structured. But the same people are going to control that state and society, and the same people are going to benefit from it. So yeah, a lot of my like beliefs and organizing have like come to a point where I do believe that you either have to like fight to dismantle the state or build structures that are completely outside of it. So yeah, it's not to discredit the work you're doing. It's more like that like I just got frustrated being like, this person probably goes to these conferences and gives this presentation over and over and over, and all these academics in the room are like, yes, that does, like, I guess resistance on the ground could make a difference. It's maybe equally as important as what I'm doing with my PhD work. And it's like, no, it's 10 times more important. So like, yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with that, except that, I guess. That's all I'm going to say.
Jadine, thank you for that really, really important intervention, that really important critique that I think we don't self-critique enough about that in academia.
Oh, no, I get that all the time. It's okay.
So thank you for bringing it up. And I'm curious if you see, this is for you or Kanahus, if you see any role for research of any kind that could directly benefit the work you do and directly benefit social movements. What would that look like? Is it possible, and what would that look like? Research, can it be supportive to social movements? If so, how? And you also don't have to answer that if you don't feel like it.
I don't know, like,
I'll let Kanahus answer that one. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think a lot of time research, it scares a lot of Native grassroots organizers and people on the ground away, like when we hear research. But then there is good things that we need documented. But this intellectual property, I believe that would be beneficial is place names, knowledge of the land, maps. Like the maps are really important for us, to get everything documented before we lose libraries of all of this geographical knowledge from our elders. And so it would be, I guess, training Indigenous people to do, for grassroots Indigenous people to do their own research and work with our own people on what kind of data that we want to record and what's the outcome of this data, because I think it's the outcome that is necessary to build our movements, but what is that? And we need to figure out the ways to properly get that information, but that's not compromising our people, that are very secure ways of gathering this intelligence that can't be, that's very well encrypted, and so people can't just get disinformation, because we do have a wealth of knowledge and we don't want it ever to be used against us. And like one time in particular, there's so much different types of research and so much things that we can benefit from, but one of the things is that one time my auntie, she's a language teacher, so she was teaching at the time, and she said, hey, there's this meeting going on in the next reserve over, you need to go to it. There's these researchers and scientists, and they're talking about our huckleberries and our scosa berries. And some of our berries, non-native people and white people have thought all this life these berries are poison, right? But now they're studying them. We didn't want to say, no, hey, these aren't poison, man. You can eat them and they're good for this and that and blah, 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 and this and that, because they're going to exploit that and they're going to use that, and it's going to say, this is for all of humanity, though. And then this knowledge is going to go and it's going to destroy those very berries that were researching in the first place. But they had good intentions, but how did that end up affecting the Indigenous people on the ground? So that's why it could be very damaging. And we know that the colonial government has been collecting data on different things throughout their life to show such things like, look at, it's all right to dispose these mine waste right into our lake. Look, it's because they're compiling their own research and their own data to prove it's safe to put in the drinking water. So that's when it gets all, I think, really frustrating for Indigenous people, and it's so lengthy a lot of times that people on the ground are being impacted like this. Like they could clear cut a whole entire mountain and destroy moose and deer and like so much habitat. It affects the Indigenous people so fast. Like we need to feel safe and being able to like even give knowledge, because it's always been taken and eventually being used against us. And really why I'm saying used against us is our land is destroyed, and they end up exploiting certain medicines on our land. Berries, huckleberries being one of them. They're saying more leaves of the huckleberries have more antioxidants than the berry itself. And so now Europe and tea companies are buying, of huckleberry leaves, which are destroying our plants, because they did research to find that these huckleberries are just, and these leaves are just so, tea is just so.
Yeah, we just lost Kanahus. Okay. Oh, maybe. Ah, she's back.
Okay, I guess that's where I'll end.
Okay, so I have quite a few questions from the audience in the room and one from the Zoom.
I'll just add like one thing to that, though, just like a quick thing, is that like I agree with everything Kanahus said, and I think like the same goes for like when you are like researching social movements, you have to understand like how that research is going to be used by state actors to actually repress those same movements. And that's like a real problem. And also like when you're doing research on like grassroots movements and then like coming up with like alternatives that you think are like operable within the current system, you're actually contributing to that process of recuperation by like taking this grassroots movement, which is like maybe potentially like an anti-state movement, and then finding solutions that work within the current system. You're actually just reinforcing the state mechanism and actually working against that movement.
Okay, so we're in the last 2 minutes of our session. We're going to have to wrap up. I think I'll ask one question from the audience. Sorry to not be able to take them all. And I think this one would be for Kanahus. One person's wondering if the tiny house movement in general, which is I think is a global movement, has provided active support for the tiny house warriors. If that's been.
No, I think right now is we need support and people that can help like get the message to a lot of these people in the tiny house movement. I think that everything falls in line with what the tiny house movement is all about. That's why that's something that we wanted to also be a part of, being, making this project or this mission or goal of Tiny House Warriors, Our Land is Home. So feel free, anyone that's watching this webinar, share this to the Tiny House Warrior community. And we need to build, and we want to do work with others in the Tiny House Warrior or the Tiny House movement, including Tiny House Nation, like all these amazing things that are coming out. I think it's something that we need to build on, and we need to work with everybody that's not is going out of the norm in how we're living in our homes right now.
Okay, I think that's a great last word. I'd just like to thank Kanahus, Jaydene, and Leah for sharing so much and for the dialogue. I'd like to thank ISC again for their support. I'd like to thank Gwen and Mary and Alex here at the conference for their support, especially the tech support that was. Would you agree that was amazingly technologically smooth? Yeah, I think that was amazing. Anyways, thank you so much for everyone who was here in person.
Thank you to you, Jen.
And thank you to everyone who attended online. And it was recorded, so we could maybe find a way to be able to, revisit those important concepts and ideas and critiques. And yeah, so thank you all, and have a great day, and good luck out there in BC and Ontario.